Somewhere on the coast of Syria, there is a letter that was never finished, and it might be the closest thing we have to a real, first-hand account of the end of the world. A man is writing it in a panic. Outside, his city is burning. Enemy ships have already landed at the harbor. And the army that's supposed to defend the walls, it isn't here. It's on a different coast entirely, fighting the exact same enemy. Because by this point, the war has spread that far, that fast. So he does the only thing left to do. He grabs wet clay, and he starts begging a neighboring king for the ships and soldiers he was promised. He tells him the enemy is already inside the gates. He never finishes that sentence. The tablet falls into the fire, consuming the building around him. And here's where the story turns strange, because that same fire, the one that was killing him, didn't destroy his words. It baked them. Clay turns to rock the instant flame touches it. Archaeologists dug that exact tablet out of the ruins of the city of Ugarit, 3,200 years after the man who wrote it died in 1192 BC. We know his city burned. We know he never got his reinforcements. What we don't know, what nobody has ever been able to prove, is exactly who was standing outside those gates. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why that question still doesn't have a clean answer, even after a century of digging. Because here's the part that should really unsettle you. His city wasn't the only one. Within about 60 years, nearly every major power in the Eastern Mediterranean, a network of empires that had traded, fought, intermarried, and written to each other as equals for 500 years, collapsed. Not one at a time, almost all together. Cities burned and simply stayed burned. In Greece, people forgot how to write for 400 years. The world's first truly connected civilization didn't decline. It stopped. Historians call it the Bronze Age collapse. It is genuinely one of the biggest unsolved mysteries in all of archaeology, and there are at least 5 competing theories for what caused it, some of which contradict each other completely. Stick around because the truth is stranger and closer to our own time than you'd expect. Here's what we actually know, starting with just how good things were right before they weren't. Chapter 1. The Golden World. About to break right before it all fell apart. This was the most connected world humanity had ever built. Egyptian pharaohs wrote to Hittite kings in Anatolia, calling them brother, even after decades of war between them. In 1259 BC, Egypt and the Hittites signed one of the earliest peace treaties in recorded history, a bilingual document, carved in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform, ending generations of conflict and sealing it with a royal marriage. For the first time, 2 rival superpowers were formally, permanently, at peace. Greek palaces imported tin from as far as Britain and Afghanistan, because bronze, the metal that named the entire age, needed copper and tin from opposite ends of the known world, and neither metal occurred naturally in the same place. A merchant ship that sank off Uluburun on the southern coast of Turkey around 1300 BC, and wasn't excavated until the 1980s, was found carrying goods from at least 7 different cultures: Canaanite, Cypriot, Mycenaean, Egyptian, Nubian, Assyrian, and Baltic amber, all in one cargo hold. Visual. The Uluburun shipwreck cargo. 10 tons of copper ingots, a ton of tin, glass beads, elephant and hippopotamus ivory, ostrich eggshells, a golden scarab bearing Nefertiti's name. This was globalization, 3,000 years early. A single sunken ship carrying more cultural diversity than most modern cargo containers. Ugarit sat right in the middle of it, a rich port city on the Syrian coast, vassal to the Hittites, home to scribes who wrote fluently in Akkadian, Ugaritic, Hittite, and Egyptian, sometimes on the same tablet. 5 great powers ran this world: the New Kingdom of Egypt, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, Mycenaean Greece, Kassite Babylon, and a rising Assyria in the east. They fought. The Battle of Kadesh, around 1274 BC, is estimated to have involved several thousand chariots, making it one of the largest chariot battles in ancient history. But they needed each other, just as much as they fought each other. Bronze needed trade routes running thousands of miles. Trade needed peace to survive. Then the first crack appeared, and it didn't look like war. It looked like hunger. Visual: Hittite Royal Archive at Hattusa, clay tablets requesting emergency grain shipments. Hittite letters from the empire's final decades are full of panic over grain. One king begs the ruler of Ugarit to send a ship and crew immediately to carry 450 tons of it, calling the shipment a matter of life and death for his kingdom. Egypt, the Hittites' old enemy, now their treaty partner, sends emergency grain too. An almost unthinkable act between two powers who had been fighting each other a generation earlier. Tree ring records, lake sediment cores, and pollen studies from Cyprus, Syria, and Greece all point to the same thing: a severe, decades-long drought hitting this exact region at this exact time, among the driest stretches the eastern Mediterranean had seen in over 1,000 years. Drought alone doesn't kill an empire, but it puts brutal, compounding pressure on kingdoms that depend on long, fragile trade lines for the grain that feeds their people and the metal that arms their soldiers. When the harvests failed in one place, there was no longer a reliable network to cover the shortfall, because that network itself was starting to fray at every knot. Into that hungry, fraying world came something the Egyptians had no single name for, something that arrived by sea, in numbers no one had ever seen before. Chapter 2. The Sea. Peoples arrive. Visual: reliefs at Medinet Habu. Ships with bird-head prows, horned and feathered warriors, ox carts loaded with families. We know about them almost entirely from the people who fought them and carved the story onto a temple wall to make sure nobody forgot. At Medinet Habu, near Luxor, Pharaoh Ramesses III commissioned massive relief carvings around 1175 BC. Recording an invasion by land and by sea at once. Groups the Egyptians named individually: the Peliset, Cheker, Danayan, Shurden, and Weshesh, among others. Historians later grouped them under one umbrella term: Sea Peoples, a 19th century label invented by scholars. No ancient source ever uses a single collective name for them, and the truth is these were probably several distinct groups moving at the same time, for related reasons, rather than one unified army. The inscriptions describe an enemy that felt unstoppable. One text, describing the lands north of Egypt just before the attack, claims that no country could stand before their weapons, that they came burning, killing, laying waste, and this was not simply an army on the march. Egyptian reliefs go out of their way to show something armies don't usually bring with them: ox carts loaded with women and children, entire households on the move. That detail matters. It suggests these were not just raiders. They were displaced people searching for somewhere new to live, likely because their own homelands had already broken down under the same drought and famine hitting the whole region at once. Ramesses III claims he defeated them in 2 decisive engagements: one land battle near Egypt's eastern border, and one naval battle at the mouth of the Nile itself, where his archers trapped the invaders' ships against the shore. Egypt survived. It was the only one of the great powers that did. But even Ramesses' own triumphant inscriptions can't fully hide the cost: contracting borders, a shrinking economy, and decades of internal instability that followed the victory, including, later in his reign, a conspiracy against his own life involving members of his royal household, uncovered by modern forensic analysis of his mummy showing his throat had been cut. Every other great power in the region did not survive the same years at all. Chapter 3. The Empire's Fall. Hattusa and Ugarit around 1200 BC. The Hittite Empire. The power that had fought Egypt to a standstill at Kadesh, the power that had signed the world's first great peace treaty, simply stops appearing in the historical record. Hattusa, the capital, was burned. Strangely, most of the royal archive was already gone before the destruction hit, which suggests the royal family evacuated with their most important records, rather than being caught completely by surprise. In the empire's final years, the western territories were already dealing with internal uprisings, and Hittite tablets refer to a figure they simply call a usurper, who seized the throne in the dynasty's last days, further weakening a kingdom that could no longer afford weakness. Vassal cities across Hittite Syria, Alalakh, Emar, Carchemish, show the same pattern of burning and abandonment in this window. Even Troy, the real archaeological site at Hisarlik in modern-day Turkey, has a destruction layer dated to roughly this same period. Though scholars are careful not to claim, this proves Homer's Trojan War actually happened as described centuries later. What the dirt does show, without any doubt, is that this entire region, city after city, was burning at once. Within a single generation, an empire that had ruled Anatolia and northern Syria for over 400 years no longer existed. Its script faded from the region within decades. And that brings us back to the letter we opened with. Ugarit's destruction layer, first excavated by French archaeologists in the 1920s and still being studied today, is violent enough that arrowheads were found embedded directly in the palace floors and walls, direct physical evidence of close combat inside the buildings, not simply a fire that spread by accident. The unfinished tablet, addressed to the king of Alasia, modern Cyprus, warning that enemy ships had already been sighted and begging for the reinforcements he'd been promised, was found half-baked inside a kiln, exactly where it landed when the roof came down. A companion letter from Ugarit's own king explains why nobody was left to defend the city. His army was away fighting in Hittite territory, and his fleet was stationed elsewhere against an entirely separate threat, leaving the richest port on the Syrian coast completely undefended at the one moment it needed defending most. Ugarit was never resettled. A city that had thrived for centuries as one of the wealthiest trading hubs in the ancient world went silent and stayed silent for good. Chapter 4. Greece Goes Dark. Far to the west, Mycenaean Greece, the world of linear B clay tablets, the world later mythologized by Homer as the age of Agamemnon and Achilles, was collapsing at almost exactly the same moment. At the Palace of Pylos, on Greece's southwestern coast, archaeologists found linear B tablets recording last-minute military preparations, rowers being mobilized, watchers posted along the coastline, an administration bracing for an attack it clearly saw coming in its final weeks. It didn't work. Pylos burned. So did Mycenae, the very city that gives the entire civilization its name, along with Tiryns, Thebes, and nearly every other major palace center in Greece, over a span of a few decades around 1200 to 1150 BC. Unlike Ugarit, there's no dramatic letter naming an attacker at Pylos. The bureaucratic record simply stops mid-preparation, and the archaeological layer directly above it is ash. What follows is one of the strangest and most telling parts of the entire collapse. Writing itself disappeared from Greece. Linear B vanished along with the palace bureaucracies that had used it to track grain stores, taxes, and troop levies. Greece would not have any writing system again for roughly 400 years, until the Phoenician-derived alphabet arrived around 800 BC. In that time, population dropped sharply across the mainland. Monumental stone architecture stopped being built, pottery styles simplified, and international trade, the very thing that had defined the age, contracted to almost nothing. Historians call this stretch the Greek Dark Age for exactly that reason. It isn't a gap in our knowledge, it's a genuine collapse in complexity that the archaeological record shows plainly, layer after layer. An entire literate civilization, one confident enough to prepare for war on paper, went completely silent for 4 centuries. Chapter 5. What actually caused it, and what was left? Here's the honest answer serious historians and archaeologists actually give, after more than 100 years of digging through this rubble. Nobody knows for certain, and it almost certainly wasn't just one thing. Drought, tree ring records, lake sediment cores, and cave stalagmite data across Cyprus, Israel, and Greece all show a severe, sustained dry period beginning in the late 1200s BC, in some regions lasting 100 years or more. It lines up almost exactly with the timing of the desperate Hittite grain letters, which is precisely why so many researchers now treat climate as the trigger that started everything else moving, a fragile, interlocking system. Some archaeologists argue no single disaster mattered as much as how connected, and therefore how fragile, this world had become. Bronze production depended on tin routes stretching thousands of miles. Grain depended on shipping. Kings depended on tribute from vassals, who depended on the very trade that was now breaking down. When enough parts of a tightly linked system fail at the same time, the whole network can unravel without needing one single knockout blow. A lesson that sounds uncomfortably familiar today. Mass migration. Whether the sea peoples caused the collapse or were themselves a symptom of it. Refugees from societies that had already broken down under drought and famine, now pushing into new territory in search of land, remains genuinely and actively debated among historians. The honest answer is probably both at once. People displaced by crisis in one region becoming, in turn, the source of crisis somewhere else, in a chain reaction, moving from west to east across the whole Mediterranean. Internal revolt. Both Egyptian and Hittite records, independently, mention uprisings from within their own populations during this period, entirely separate from any foreign invasion. A sign that once the grain stopped arriving, some of these kingdoms may have been just as vulnerable to their own hungry, desperate people as they were to outsiders. Earthquakes, a more contested theory. Some archaeologists, examining collapsed walls and skeletal remains at specific sites, have proposed a cluster of major earthquakes striking the region in these decades, sometimes called an earthquake storm. Most historians treat this at most as one contributing factor at a handful of individual sites, rather than a cause of the wider collapse. The most widely accepted view today isn't a single villain. It's a perfect storm, each piece feeding the next. Drought, weakening food supplies, food shortages triggering both migration and internal unrest, and that unrest straining the exact trade networks every kingdom depended on to arm its soldiers and feed its people, which in turn made every kingdom more vulnerable to whatever shock came next, climatic, military, or political. Once enough dominoes were already leaning against each other, it didn't take much to bring the whole board down at once. By 1150 BC, the world that had existed just 50 years earlier was almost entirely gone. The Hittite Empire had vanished completely from the map. Mycenaean Greece had entered 4 centuries of population decline and lost its writing system outright. Ugarit was ash, and so were dozens of smaller cities across Cyprus and the Levant that rarely make it into the history books at all. Only Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon survived as functioning states through the worst of it, and even Egypt emerged permanently, smaller, poorer, and less influential abroad than it had been just a generation before. What followed across the region has been called, by multiple generations of archaeologists, a genuine dark age. Not simply a gap in our records, but a real, measurable collapse in population, trade, architecture, and in Greece's case, literacy itself, lasting for centuries. It would take until roughly 900 to 800 BC, with Assyria resurgent, Phoenician traders rebuilding maritime networks from scratch, and Greece slowly climbing back out of illiteracy, for anything resembling that old interconnected world to exist again. And when it finally did return, it looked almost nothing like what had come before it. The scribe in Ugarit never finished his letter. He never got his reinforcements. His city never came back. But the fire that killed him preserved his last words for over 3,000 years, a fragment of a world that thought it would last forever at the exact moment it stopped. We still don't fully know why the Bronze Age world collapsed, but we know with total certainty that it did. And for the people living through it, it must have felt like the end of the world, because in every way that mattered, it was.